Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. On today's episode, the History Guy tells two stories surrounding the day that lives in infamy, December 7th. First, he tells the story of the first shots fired and the first ship sunk in the Pacific War. Then, he tells the story of what happened afterward on December 8th. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
Today is Pearl Harbor Day, the anniversary of the Japanese attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet that President Franklin Roosevelt called a date which will live in infamy. Among the many stories of heroism on this day is one of a small, outdated vessel crewed by naval reservists that played a unique role in the Second World War and the attack on Pearl Harbor. This scrappy vessel demonstrated the spirit of the U.S. Navy and the determination of the nation through two wars and some of the hardest fighting in the history of the Navy. The history of the USS Ward deserves to be remembered. James Harmon Ward had an extraordinary career in the Navy. Appointed a midshipman in 1823, he served aboard Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution in the Atlantic Squadron. Later he served in the blockade of Africa, an operation that cooperated with the British Royal Navy to intercept and stop the West African slave trade. And then in the West Indies, fighting pirates. Because doesn't every great story involve pirates? A naval scholar, Ward taught courses for midshipmen and authored textbooks on naval theory and practice. When, in 1845, Secretary of the Navy George Bancroft formed a naval school on the grounds of the former U.S. Army Fort Severn in Annapolis, Maryland, James Harmon Ward was one of the first 5 founders and the first commandant of midshipmen of what would eventually be called the U.S. Naval Academy. At the advent of the U.S. Civil War, he was given command of the Potomac Squadron. There, in the June 1861 Battle of Matthias Point, he was leading from the front, having brought his flagship, the steamer USS Thomas Freeborn, close to shore to protect a retreating shore party. While sighting the ship's bow gun, Commander Ward was killed by sniper fire. He was the first U.S. naval officer killed fighting in the Civil War, and his name would carry on in the U.S. Navy. The development of the self-propelled torpedo in the 1860s led to a new vessel for naval service, the torpedo boat. These small, cheap, and fast boats could run out and engage large ships with torpedoes and then retreat. The first successful use of such a boat to sink an armored ship with a self-propelled torpedo occurred during the Chilean Civil War of 1891, when the torpedo gunboat Almirante Lynch sank the armored frigate Blanco Encalada in the Battle of Caldera Bay. The development of the torpedo boat then gave rise to another class of vessel, the torpedo boat destroyer, whose purpose was to screen larger warships from attacks by torpedo boats and be able to fire torpedoes themselves. The first boat of this type built for the United States was the USS Bainbridge, commissioned in 1903. U.S. Navy destroyer designs evolved quickly. By 1916, when it was increasingly clear that the U.S. may be drawn into the First World War and the Navy was being greatly expanded, the Naval Appropriations Act called for the construction of 50 Wickes-class destroyers, vessels with a displacement of 1,154 tons, nearly 3 times the size of the 420-ton Bainbridge commissioned just 13 years earlier. The submarine threat that became apparent during the Great War gave greater impetus to produce destroyers, and eventually 267 of the Wickes class and the similar Clemson class destroyers were built. One of those was the USS Ward. Designed for high speed and mass production, Wickes-class destroyers were larger than previous U.S. designs, largely because of the requirement that they be able to make 35 knots, fast enough to keep up with the Lexington and Omaha-class cruisers. The larger design used a single deck that was continuous from stem to stern, differentiating it from previous U.S. destroyer designs that had a raised forecastle. Thus, the Wickes and the closely related Caldwell and Clemson-class destroyers were commonly called the flush deck destroyers. They had 2 boilers and thus 4 stacks. Armament was 4 4-inch 50 caliber guns, 12 21-inch torpedo tubes, a 3-inch 23 caliber anti-aircraft gun, and depth charges. Built at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard near Vallejo, California, the construction of the USS Ward is a testament to the extent of the U.S. mobilization during the First World War. The Navy was emphasizing destroyer production, even delaying the production of cruisers to facilitate more destroyers being built. Under this pressure, the ship's keel for USS Ward was laid May 15, 1918, and she was launched June 1st, marking a U.S. record for the production of a destroyer of only 17 days. Ward was commissioned into service on July 24th, one of only a handful of Wickes-class vessels completed in time to serve during the Great War, and was the flagship of the Destroyer Division 18, but saw no combat. In May of 1919, Ward was part of a famous first, participating in a chain of Navy ships that provided navigational aid and lifeguard station for a U.S. Navy Curtiss flying boat, which became the first aircraft of any kind to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, or any of the other oceans for that matter. In 1921, with most of her sister ships, Ward was decommissioned and placed in reserve in San Diego. But in January 1941, with war on the horizon, Ward was recommissioned, manned by reservists of the Minnesota Naval Reserve, which had been called to active duty during the same month. Many of the recommissioned ships were sent to the Atlantic to protect convoys, but Ward was sent to Hawaii, arriving in March. She was assigned, along with 3 other World War I-era destroyers, to patrol the harbor entrance to Pearl Harbor, where the U.S. Pacific Fleet had been moved. 1941 was a tense year. The U.S. and Japan were at odds over Japanese actions in China and Indochina. The U.S. froze Japanese assets on July 26, 1941, and on August 1st established an embargo on oil and gasoline exports to Japan. While negotiations were ongoing, tensions were high, and in November the Coastal Patrol was given orders to depth charge suspicious submarine contacts, in essence, permission to shoot, as submarines that entered territorial waters while submerged were not protected by innocent passage protections. On December 5th, Ward got a new commander, Lieutenant William Outerbridge, a 1927 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. Ward was his first command, having been executive officer aboard the destroyer USS Cummings. 2 days later, Ward was on her routine patrol outside Pearl Harbor around 4 a.m. when she received visual signals via signal light from the Coast Guard manned coastal minesweeper USS Condor. The Condor had a tentative sighting of a periscope. Ward called to general quarters and conducted a search using sonar for the next hour, but turned up no contacts. At 6:40, the General Store's issue ship Antares, waiting outside the harbor for a favorable tide, sent another signal about a suspicious object off her stern. Ward's lookout saw, behind the Antares, a small wake, the sign of a periscope, the risk for which they had been warned in November. At first, the watch commander thought it might be a buoy, but decided probably it was a conning tower of a submarine, although the U.S. didn't have anything that looked like that in its Navy. The officer on the bridge, Lieutenant Gepner, sent for Captain Outerbridge, who was sleeping in the nearby ready cabin. Outerbridge came to the bridge still wearing his pajamas. By his observation, it looked to be a submarine, apparently intent on following the Antares into Pearl Harbor. Following the order that had been issued in November, Outerbridge ordered an attack, charging the contact. The first shot came from the No. 1 4-inch gun mount, but went long. The No. 3 gun came to bear, firing a second round. The submarine was so close that the shot was below the gun's targeting reticle. The gunner had to fire by sight alone. The shot seemed to hit the submarine's conning tower, but the crew couldn't be sure. Ward then dropped 4 depth charges. Outerbridge sent a message to the 14th Naval District headquarters. He wanted to be clear because he did not want them to mistake the attack as being on just an unidentified sonar contact. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area," he reported. The message should have been a warning that an enemy attack was imminent, but the message took time to work its way through channels, and command then required confirmation. Another destroyer was sent to help search for contacts, but the Navy did not grasp the significance of the event. Ward saw other sonar contacts and fired more depth charges, but saw no more submarines. They were still outside the harbor when the air attack began. The crew at first thought the explosions they were hearing were from highway work. The submarine the Ward had seen was a Japanese Type A midget submarine, one of 5 that had been launched from larger submarines some 10 miles from Pearl Harbor on December 6th. The Type A was about 75 feet long, carried 2 450mm torpedoes, and had a range of about 100 nautical miles. The question of what the Ward saw and whether it scored a hit was not definitively answered until August of 2002, when researchers from the University of Hawaii finally discovered the wreckage of the submarine, with a clean hole through the conning tower, right where Outerbridge had said the No. 3 gun had hit. Thus, the first shot between the United States and Japan in the Pacific War was fired by the USS Ward, and in the second shot of that war, the Ward had struck home, sunk the Japanese submarine. The first casualties and first vessel loss in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor were Japanese rather than American. USS Ward continued her duties outside Pearl Harbor through the end of the year, but in 1942 was sent to California to be one of 17 Wickes-class vessels to be refitted as high-speed transports. High-speed transports were a new concept. These converted destroyers were designed to be able to disembark troops under fire. Their armament was sufficient to defend themselves from small naval ships and to provide fire support, while they were fast enough to avoid larger ships. Their primary role was to deliver small units, such as Marine Raiders or Army Rangers. The flush-deck destroyers were a good fit for the role, as removing the second boiler, and consequently 2 of the 4 stacks, allowed accommodation for 200 troops, a company-sized unit, while reducing the top speed to 25 knots. The torpedo tubes were removed, allowing room to mount 4 large landing craft. In addition, Ward's older 4-inch 50 caliber guns were replaced with newer 3-inch 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns. Along with depth charges, the high-speed transport was effective both as an anti-aircraft screen and an anti-submarine role. High-speed transports were given the designation APD, AP meaning transport, and D meaning destroyer. The former USS Ward was redesignated APD-16 and was ready for service in February 1943. The work of the fast transports was arduous, combining the roles of transports and destroyers. APD-16 participated in a dizzying array of operations in the Solomon Islands and the invasion of New Guinea. In December 1944, the ship was engaged in landing operations supporting the invasion of the island of Leyte, the beginning of the operation to recapture the Philippines. On a patrol assignment, the APD-16 and the destroyer USS Mahan came under air attack by a group of Japanese G4M Betty bombers with escort fighters. 3 broke off to attack the high-speed transport. Her blazing gun splashed 2. The third was hit, but crashed into APD-16 amidships, hitting so hard that one of the plane's 2 engines continued on through the ship, exiting at the waterline on the starboard side. The bomber exploded, starting uncontrollable fires. The ship came to a stop, her crew attempting to fight the fires, but the hoses had lost pressure. They received assistance from the destroyer USS O'Brien, but as the fires burned towards the fuel and ready ammunition storage, the ship's commander, Lieutenant Raymond Forrest Farwell Jr., had to give the order to abandon ship. Miraculously, only 1 member of the crew had been injured, and the crew was safely evacuated to other ships. As the fires were beyond control, USS O'Brien was ordered to sink the burning transport with gunfire. In a stunning coincidence, the former USS Ward went under at 11:30 a.m. on December 7th, 3 years to the day after she fired the first shot of the war in the Pacific. The commander of the USS O'Brien, ordered to sink the gallant ship, was William Outerbridge, who had commanded her that day outside Pearl Harbor. USS Ward earned 1 battle star as a destroyer and 8 battle stars as a high-speed transport. Her distinguished service and dogged determination well represented the Navy in the Pacific Campaign. Ward's number 3 4-inch 50 caliber gun that fired the second shot and sunk the first enemy vessel of the Pacific War was removed when the ship went in for refit in 1942. In 1958, that gun was installed as a memorial out front the Minnesota State Capitol in St. Paul. The wreckage of the former USS Ward was discovered by the research vessel RV Petrel in December 2017. William Outerbridge continued to serve with the Navy until 1957, when he retired as a Rear Admiral. He passed away in 1986 at the age of 80.
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and some behind-the-scenes stuff that you only get to hear about on the podcast. We would like to welcome Betty Jo, my grandmother and mother of the history guy, back to the podcast, and we would also like to dedicate this podcast to the memory of the many people who fought and died at Pearl Harbor. You know, one of the things that struck me about this episode is that this is about a small ship, and that each and every one of these ships has a name and is named for somebody important, or at least someone who did something and deserves to be remembered. And I think about how many of those little destroyers there were, hundreds of them.
Yeah, the flush deckers, hundreds, yeah, and they're all named after someone that was important to the Navy. That's true. Yeah, and you think about them because they're not that big. They're 1,000-ton displacement or whatever. I think a destroyer today is like 8,000. So they're really fairly small. They're smaller than frigates today, but they did such service. Those flush deckers. Those are what we gave in to the UK as part of Lend-Lease, and the complaint was that they're kind of old and dated and they can't really chase things at a World War I level, and it's amazing the service that they continue to show. And the Ward is a great example of that. It's an absolutely stunning example of that, with what it did in the time that it did, including firing the first shot of the Pacific War. The first real war shot that the U.S. fired in the Second World War was the Ward.
Yeah, which is amazing, and it's not something I think you think about.
No.
It is another good example of these ideas about how I think that some people go to conspiracy, but how we missed signs is it sure feels like we should have been able to we should have been more on alert.
I mean, the message had to make it all the way up through.
Yeah.
It had to be verified. But the thing is, no one was really clear. I mean, this is the Minnesota Navy Reserve, right? I mean, there's no oceans in Minnesota. So, I mean, I think anybody was sure what they were shooting at. And I mean, because they weren't even terribly sure. I mean, Outerbridge was very clear in his message that this wasn't us just shooting at a random, sonar ping, because they did that a lot. He says, we saw something, we shot it. But I mean, no one was actually sure that what the ward had reported was what had actually happened until they found the submarine in 2002.
Yeah.
So I mean, but it is in terms of all of the warnings that they have for Pearl Harbor, we saw an unidentified submarine that was seeking to enter the harbor would seem to be an indication that something bad is going on.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of talk about that. I mean, that's whether who knew what or whether we responded to
how many was missed messages. I mean, certainly there's always been this argument that FDR knew it was coming and they didn't tell anyone because he wanted the surprise attack in order to bring the nation to war. Yeah, that's been researched quite a lot, and I'll just have to say from my own research on the subject, I just don't think history supports it. I think that there's too much evidence saying never ascribe to a conspiracy what could be ascribed to incompetency. And I think that's really what it comes down to. A lot of messaging that was sent to the General Short and Admiral Kimmel was convoluted, and they were both convinced that the Japanese would never attack the whole Pacific Fleet there. Pearl Harbor was just too strong. You wouldn't take it on. And so when they, mistook the radar signals as being maybe B-17s that were coming in, all that stuff that they talked about, there's probably nothing more, direct than we have seen and engaged an enemy vessel outside of Pearl Harbor that was missed. I mean, I imagine how many messages that SINCPAC gets at that sort of time, and what had to come up through and get what the meaning of that was. So it is a tragedy, because at least, had they appreciated that, then at least, we could have been more prepared. We could have, had the planes in the air or dispersed, or, I mean, all that, even with an hour's warning, you could have made a difference in terms of the amount of lives lost.
But just think about those guys. They're sitting on that boat and they think it's a periscope, for God's sake. Now think about what that must have been like.
On a little submarine that size.
And one that size and so forth, and the fact that they were smart enough to do that.
Yeah.
But it's so easy to look back and say this fits this and this fits this. We do that every day, and unfortunately,
that's all. That's
we,
all hindsight.
We have the facts. We know. We know what happened there.
Yeah. You always say there were warnings, and maybe but whether you're gonna, there's a lot of things that you get warnings and it doesn't actually happen. But I mean, it's so much kudos to them, because you get this order like in late November that says if you see a submarine, you can shoot it. You're not expecting that's actually going to happen.
No.
And so they're looking at this thing, and they're standing there looking at there with binoculars, saying, I don't know, and look at anything we recognize, and that they decide to shoot. But also, darn, the shooting. I mean, it was below the targeting reticle. The guy just kind of hip shot that little submarine,
and hit it.
Plugged it right through the conning tower. Those are not large at all.
No, it was a good shot, and of course, we weren't able to confirm that he actually had hit anything for decades after the war,
for decades until the 21st century. But you have to it's just such a shock. I mean, I don't think anybody really thinks about it. The very first casualty of the Pacific War and the first vessel sunk was not one of the U.S. vessels in Pearl Harbor, but it was a Japanese vessel outside of Pearl Harbor. The first casualties of the U.S. entering the war, were on the Japanese side, not the American side, and yet still they were able to carry out a counter or a surprise attack that we weren't warned for. That's and it had to be quite a surprise to the crew of that submarine for a moment. For not very long. But
that was probably a bit unsettling, that you think you're being all hidden in secret, and it would just get plugged before anything even happened.
It's just such a good story. I mean, those were it's just amazing. It just says how good those sailors were at their job. The Minnesota Naval National Guard, but they were patrolling, and they knew that was important. They knew what they were doing was important. They're in this old. I mean, we would have considered old, outdated destroyer, and they understood the situation, and they reacted absolutely appropriately, and they hit. It took them 2 shots, I guess.
They're apparently one of very few people in the situation who did respond.
Yeah. We talk so much about the few pilots who got in the air and et cetera, or the few people got to their machine guns very quickly. here this is a great example of that. I mean, people had every reason to be complacent and to question whether they were looking at a submarine, and they did their job. And so there's some interesting heroism there because they were kind of put out there as old submarines patrolling the outside. I don't think that anybody was really taking them all that seriously, and son of a gun had every reason to. But also, I mean, I've forgotten all that's in this episode. We rewatched it today. I mean, talking about the development of destroyers and talking about the development of U.S. destroyers and then the flush jet destroyers. But it goes on to such a good story too, where we took these really kind of outdated destroyers and we turned them into these fast transports. And it's something, compared to a landing ship, they're much better armed. And so you took out the second boiler, you had enough room to put a whole company of troops in there, you took out the torpedoes, which they were unlikely to use anyway, and then you put in landing vessels, and these things could come in and defend a landing party and land a landing party and go faster than a landing ship and still be able to defend themselves. And then we put them out on the anti-aircraft pickets, which was a very, very dangerous place to be, which eventually we find out with the war. And so it really shows how great, I mean, for this aged vessel, built for another war. I mean, how much service they saw, and how much, and that says a lot about all that we did in terms of resources in the Second World War. It wasn't all about the new vessels. It was, some of these saw just extraordinary service. We've done some episodes on these, these old ships that just, they distinguish themselves. I think Ward is one of those.
Well, in an interesting way.
Named after the first commandant of cadets at the Naval Academy.
Yeah. And it's his story was interesting too, to talk about this guy who I think otherwise was totally forgotten. I mean, who knows who he was.
We'd always, I like to give some background, and sometimes people get a little tired of that, and they don't want that, and they want to get right to the story. And a lot of times we've got so much story to tell with the amount of time that we have that we really can't. So we can't talk about what is the namesake of the ship or something like that. But I'd like to. I think it's important that we talk about the namesake of the ship, and because that's what ties all that naval history together.
Yeah. Well, and like I said at the beginning, all these ships hit these names. I mean, those were all people who they were worthy of having a ship named after them, and they did something. Yeah. We just you just list off a bunch of destroyers or something like that, and in this battle or that battle, and you don't have any idea who they're named after.
They are, yeah. You can see that when you were looking at the map that shows all the ships that were involved in the transatlantic crossing of the Curtis flying boats, and how many ships we had at sea, this summer, this last summer, I had the honor of being invited out to the commissioning of a Coast Guard cutter, and these I think there's 57 of these classic cutter now, and they're all named after distinguished Coast Guard enlisted personnel. I mean, there's sense in how we name them, and that you've had 57 of those where the name was important enough to talk about its history. Yeah. And I was invited out there because the person, Maurice Jester, had been part of one of my episodes. And so, I mean, there's so much history tied into the Navy. And that's I mean, USS Ward served so bravely, and I think it served, and something that did their namesake brave. Yeah. I mean, the officer who died because he could have been sitting in the back, and instead he was in the front sight, literally sighting the gun when he got shot by a sniper. Yeah.
I was in the airport yesterday visiting with a man who came out. He had fought. He was in the Vietnam War, was wearing his Navy hat and was on his way to flying to Illinois. And he says that he was on the last ship that went through the Suez Canal during the Six-Day War. Huh. And they actually went through, and the ship behind them was the one that was bombed, and the one that actually blocked the channel.
So they sunk the ship behind them was one they sunk to block the canal.
That blocked the canal, and so he had stories to tell.
Good
but
heavens.
Here is this very nice looking older man in his Navy hat, so proudly and telling me that story, which I thought was neat.
Part of history.
And he could have been one that we would name a ship after. It's it's really part of our life and part of what we need to honor.
Mm-hmm. And a number of the people that we talk about, the heroes that we talk about, end up having ships named after them and things. I mean, there's ways that we honor these people who served, who made a difference. The story of the war, though, too. I mean, just you could not write this. It's one of these truth stranger than fiction that it would sink 3 years later on December 7th.
And sank
probably the first shots and sank by Outerbridge's ship. Yeah, the guy that captained it at Pearl Harbor was the one who had to sink the ship later when it was on fire. And that also shows the danger. Those kamikazes. I mean, three planes attacked. They shot down 2 of them. The third one hit so hard that it went all the way through. Parts of it came out the other side of the ship. and they lost her. They lost the war. And
we lost some large ships to kamikazes, but those smaller ships were, I mean, in a lot of ways in more danger.
They were really sacrificial lands out there. They were doing that to expand the radar picket so that you could see the planes coming farther out. But I mean, they were very vulnerable. There's a reason that they called the destroyers Tin Can Navy, because they simply didn't have a lot of armor. They were built to be a small ship who could keep up with the speed of the large ships, and that didn't leave you a lot of room to protect your deck from it. So and I mean, though, even in that story, only one sailor injured. I mean, that's
amazing. Too. That's I mean, many more people
Burn was a total loss, and everybody got off. Yeah,
it's incredible. And they've found the ship now, right? The wreck.
RV Petrol did discover. Yeah,
it's amazing. We discover more and more of these ships that have been lost, and we've done a lot of work recently, in the last couple of decades, finding so many of them that went down. And I think that's really cool that we can still see some of these, and some of them. I mean, we knew where the war sunk, but there are other ones we have had no idea where they sunk. They were just gone at some point. And I try to think of finding those in the middle of the ocean. I mean, there's a lot of space down there.
That's extraordinary. That's making you wonder. I mean, how much oil and gas and ordnance and all sorts of stuff under.
And like what it was like to see that little periscope. Right?
Oh yeah, it can't have been big at all. Yeah, and they see the wake. Yeah,
and to have taken the shot.
Yeah, I'm sure he was thinking, I'll just follow this ship in. It'll be easy.
No one will have any idea.
Well, and kudos to them too, because first it was contacted by a Coast Guard minesweeper, and then but it was the stores ship that was going in that noticed them hanging out behind him.
Yeah.
And it also shows the challenge. I mean, those mini submarines, those midget submarines that they launch off a larger submarine. There are 4 of them apparently, and one of them might have gotten in Pearl Harbor. They don't know that for sure, but there's some indication that they might have.
They weren't as successful as maybe they wanted them to be, but I mean, they certainly had a potential.
No, I mean they were. That's, you don't imagine you're going to get home, right? No. I mean, right? So that was they faced an enormous challenge trying to get inside through the submarine nets and the pickets and all that sort of stuff and a chance they had like 2 torpedoes, so two chances to hurt something, and almost certainly you're never going to get home.
Do you think he volunteered to be on a 2-man sub?
I don't know.
That's a good question. I will say the Japanese did seem to have some well, I mean, I guess that's true of any army. You had people who were willing to do jobs that
kamikaze.
Yeah, right. They are jobs that I would hesitate.
Yeah. I mean, they weren't asking them to ram into the ship, so I don't know. But I mean, that's I mean, you have to say that was, and this shows how difficult that challenge was. Yeah. These 2 men died serving their country. Yeah. Because they were trying to do something that was very difficult to do. Yeah.
Whether we appreciate what they were trying to do or not, that was, they from their perspective. And I think that some of the things we forget about, when we talk about signs and stuff like that. I mean, there was a very tense situation going on in 41. We were certainly concerned about the conflict, and I think we forget. We think, the surprise attack. We forget that there was all this buildup. Where we.
I mean, the evidence is quite clear that we knew that war with Japan was inevitable. Despite the diplomatic efforts, we knew it was inevitable. The diplomatic relations had broken down. Really, I mean, they sent them the warning order in November. So, I mean, I don't think. I mean, when the Japanese attacked, everybody knew who was attacking. Yeah. I think everybody there knew that. But I mean, they were just surprised by the timing and the location. And honestly, when you try to look over what the thinking really was at Pearl Harbor, the real thinking was that the battle fleet was so powerful. That's the reason it was moved from Long Beach to Pearl Harbor. The battle fleet was so powerful that the Japanese would never dare attack. Aside from other areas that were supposed to do reconnaissance, but the Army Air Force was arguing with the Navy over who was supposed to do that, and no one was apparently doing it. And it really is coincidence. I mean, there's this argument because the aircraft carriers weren't there. It was a sign that we knew it was coming or whatever. And it's really coincidence where the aircraft carriers were. I think if you understand where the aircraft carriers were, there wasn't any plan about that. I'm also like that,
just not sure that we, by the end of the war, we figured out that aircraft carriers were probably the most important ships in the fleet. That wasn't as clear in 1941, and I'm just not sure that we would have had the foresight.
That we would necessarily save the aircraft carriers because they ended up being so important to us because they were only capital ships after the damage to the battleships at Pearl Harbor. But I mean, we knew because the Essex class carriers had already been ordered. I mean, that great expansion of the Navy actually was already in play before Pearl Harbor.
Probably the only reason why we were able to respond as quickly as we did is because
because we'd already designed the ships. We were already so it's not like we didn't know war was coming, but we certainly didn't know it was coming there that day.
No.
And whether we should have known, whether we missed too many hints, or I don't know. But and yeah, I don't know. That's kind of off topic for the word. I mean, I'm sure there's people that are still arguing that that we knew that was coming or whatever. I think the evidence is that we don't. Kimmel certainly. Who said, I've been better off with that because a bullet came through his window, a 50 caliber bullet, and stuck in his uniform. And he says, I've been better off if it killed me. I mean, so he knew at that point that that he had messed up. I mean, I don't think Kimmel ever denied that sort of culpability. But I mean, it's a much broader culpability across government and across the military that would say that we would miss that something this size could be happening.
Yeah. Well, and it's something I think that we think it's obvious in hindsight, like Betty Jo said, and at the time they didn't have that. They believed all kinds of things, and whether they believed them fairly or not.
Well, they believed the attack was probably going to come to the south.
And the major problem, basically, when we look back, is today with the communications we have. But when you think about what it took for them to get the word about what they had done all the way through, and part of it was just the fact that you didn't have instant knowledge.
Yeah,
it makes a total difference.
I don't know how much better we would be today, or not. I imagine they still get so many messages coming through.
Well, and you have to.
I don't know how much. I'm not in the military.
I hope
we'd be better at it.
We've certainly, I think that from things like this, we've made a lot of efforts to try to make sure that we can identify.
I would hope so. But I mean, if a U.S. naval vessel caught an enemy submarine outside of Pearl Harbor.
I would hope
how quickly would we get the hint? Would we be faster than this, or would it take hours?
I mean, it's fair, and the thing is that was very last minute. I mean, that submarine
was literally hours before the attack.
Some of that is that was failures before that we didn't know the attack was coming, and by the time we were seeing stuff on our radar, that's. We're already at a pretty significant disadvantage.
They were in denial, and the word kind of shows that too. Even the ward, after the attacks that it did, when they first started hearing the bombs going off, they said they thought that was highway work. They didn't connect. Even the ward, who had seen and thought they'd sunk an enemy submarine, still didn't understand the attack was occurring when the attack occurred.
Well, if you guys don't know, in addition to our YouTube channel and the podcast, we have a website, thehistoryguy.com, and that's got a collection of everything that we do. It's got our podcasts, It's got all our most recent videos. It's got some really neat ways for you to explore our really very large collection of videos, which can be a little daunting.
It's easier sorted than finding them on YouTube, and so it's if you really want to see by topic or by region, then you can find that on the webpage. And it's so easy, thehistoryguy.com. You can also buy our merchandise there. If you really love The History Guy, you can donate to us directly there with PayPal. But if you want to find also a place where all the podcasts are collected in the same place that all of the videos are collected, it's a one-stop shop, and it's a beautiful webpage. It's called thehistoryguy.com. Yeah, great place to buy Christmas gifts. There you go. That's for the history lover who wants a T-shirt.
Say Merry Christmas with a History Guy shirt or a mug.
Merry Christmas.
Or the new stickers or magnets, the new magnets.
Sticker magnets. Yeah, magnets. They're new, yeah. You can get them there.
Next up, the History Guy tells the story of what happened afterward on December 8th.
December 7th, 1941 might be the date that lives in infamy, but those words were actually used by President Franklin Roosevelt 80 years ago today on December 8th, before a joint session of Congress that was broadcast live to the nation at around 12:30 in the afternoon. Despite all the theories about forewarning of the attack and the extent to which the United States had already involved itself in the world conflict, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the nation, left behind confusion, fear, and a deep sense of purpose. But nowhere was the weight of history more obvious after the attack on December 7th than in the territory of Hawaii where the attack occurred. Residents of that territory woke up the next day to look at the newspaper and see a world forever changed. The immediate impact of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on the territory of Hawaii deserves to be remembered. The December 8th, 1941 edition of the Honolulu Advertiser represents the shock and confusion of the Japanese attack. Front-page stories report the experience of the paper's reporters the day before. The streets were lined from one end of the city to the other with men and women and children, some still in their pajamas and nightshirts. All were looking westward, most of them with a somewhat perplexed expression on their faces. Another headline reads, "Civilian toll, 37 dead, many hurt." But the paper also includes incongruities. Page 3 has a sizable article called Merit Parade, listing area youth. "Someday jovial and fun Florence will have a doctor's degree. One of the most outstanding girls in the Momoa Valley School is Doris, a senior and honor student." Alberto Alfonso wants to be a musician. Charles Potts, a journalist. Another article talks about the December birthstone. A column reviews plays on Broadway, and an ad shows a Yank in the RAF, starring Tyrone Power and Betty Grable as playing, at the Waikiki Theater. A comic has Lil Abner excited about pork chops for dinner. These mundane stories that would be recognized in any local paper of the time are almost surreal, next to lists of civilian casualties. Portuguese girl, unidentified, age 10, address unknown, puncture wound, left temple. And stories about reporters on their way to the naval base seeing red sparks bouncing up from the pavement in front of us as a plane we don't know whose flew close overhead from the rear, and we could hear the now familiar rat-tat-tat-tat. It's hard to wrap your mind around people being told to boil their water because tests haven't yet determined whether it is contaminated, and that the Navy, to shoot all ships not identified, also needed a story about how dress sleeves were long and notably full that season. Even in Honolulu, on December 8th, 1941, immediately after the attack, people did not seem to realize how much the world had changed, or how little the length of dress sleeves would matter in the coming years. But there is much in that December 8th edition to foreshadow the dramatic changes that would be affecting the U.S. territory following the attack. The headline reads, "Saboteurs land here." Warning that a party of saboteurs had been landed on northern Oahu was given early Sunday morning by the Army. The saboteurs were distinguished by red discs on their shoulders. Renewed Japanese bombing attacks on Oahu reported the morning of the 8th. A report from the United Press says that a naval engagement was in progress off Honolulu, going so far as to say that NBC Radio heard from a Panama report that a Japanese aircraft carrier was sunk. These stories show how confused information was. The website History on the Net notes neither the naval battle off Honolulu nor the repeated radio reports about the Japanese paratroopers on the ground in Honolulu were true. But there was no immediate clarification, and in the days following, speculation fed a bonfire of anxiety that would rage beyond control. The severity of the immediate damage is obvious in the paper. A box on page 1 proclaims, "Blood donors, urgently needed." A request that was repeated on December 10th. While most histories of the attack on Pearl Harbor focus on the strategic effects, the ships that were sunk and damaged, immediate impacts like shutting down radio stations for fear that the Japanese could navigate by them, and the delay of local newspapers means that the true story of what the people in Hawaii were experiencing was relatively muted. Military reports from the day are surprisingly incomplete, and the nation was distracted by the United States entry into the war. But the immediate situation was terrible. Professor Johnny Bowen of the University of Hawaii, Manoa, wrote a history of the response by the Honolulu Fire Department. It was about a 12-minute response for Engine 6 to Hickam Field, so Fireman Richard Young, Harry Tuck, Lee Pang, and Bill Tam, riding the wagon's rear step, had plenty of time to contemplate what they were getting into. Young said, "As we responded over winding Moanalua Road and Puloa Road, we saw towering columns of black smoke with flames leaking hundreds of feet into the sky." Firehouse, a website for fire rescue professionals, described the experience of the men of Honolulu Fire Department's Engine Number 6. Reaching the main gate, the men of Engine 6 were relieved that the bombing strafing an anti-aircraft return fire had stopped, but were awed by what they saw. An underground gas main had been hit and was spewing flames dozens of feet into the air right near the front gate. As they passed the column of flame, the bigger picture began to come into focus. Dead, dying, and wounded military personnel lay everywhere. A large barrack struck by a bomb was burning fiercely. Across the road, several hangars and a quarter-mile-long line of parked planes was also blazing. Hickam Field's own firefighting equipment had been hit in the initial attack. Bowen writes, "One engine had been driven about 20 feet out onto the ramp, apparently trying to respond, before it was strafed by the low-flying Japanese planes. The driver was slumped over the steering wheel, dead. The other engine never got out of the station." Firehouse goes on. Now joined by Engine Number 4, they found that they were the only firefighting force available to handle the multiple fires, rescue efforts, and body recoveries surrounding them. The airfield's water main had been severed, and the hydrants were out of service. Fire crews pumped water from a bomb crater. As Honolulu engines started to arrive, the second wave of Japanese attackers came. For the next 15 minutes, all hell rained down on the Honolulu firemen and the remaining military scattered across the airfield. Bombs whistled in, shaking the ground as they detonated, one after another. Streams of machine gun bullets screaming through the sky, stitching death across the smoke-filled fire ground. Shrapnel ripped through the air, tearing off those huddled on the ground, trying to make themselves invisible to the pilots and machine gunners above. Equipment was damaged in the attacks. Bowen writes, "Their apparatus, all manufactured by the Seagrave Corporation and much of it 10 years old and chain-driven, had been repeatedly strafed and hit by bomb fragments. The chemical tank of Engine 1's wagon was pierced by shrapnel, and Engine 6's pumper had too many bullet holes to count. Wagon 6 was afire. The pumpers of engines 1 and 4 had been severely damaged by a hail of shrapnel. All 6 tires were punctured on engine 1's pumper. Radiators of several units were spewing miniature geysers of water through their bullet holes. But that didn't keep them from their job. He continues, they got their damaged apparatus functioning by using brown soap and toilet paper to plug the holes in the radiators. No one remembers exactly where these supplies came from. Seemingly they just materialized, most logically from the toilets in the burning barracks. But the fires weren't limited to military facilities. Bowen writes, the bombs had barely stopped falling when the HFD Alarm Bureau became deluged with calls from assistants ranging from reports of live electrical wires to bomb strikes to serious building fires. Lopez said that there were so many alarm boxes being pulled that one round was coming in on top of another. Alexander Beck, a hosman at engine number 4, was operating a reserve pumper that was dispatched to the Honolulu Gas Company in Iwilei for a gas storage tank fire. Bowen quoted Beck, one of their 2 huge tanks was burning. I really wondered how we were ever going to get that fire out. A bomb or maybe an unexploded anti-aircraft shell had blasted a hole in the top of the tank. Gas was shooting up through this hole and was burning spectacularly. 3 members of the Honolulu Fire Department, Captain John Carrera, Captain Thomas Macy, and hosman Harry T.L. Pang, were killed in the attacks. 3 others were injured and awarded Purple Hearts, an award that is usually reserved for members of the military. Bowen notes, the HFD had earned the distinction of being the only civilian fire department in the United States to fight fires caused by enemy action under combat conditions. As fires raged, the community faced the problem of dealing with the wounded. The website of pearlharbor.org writes, dead bodies were everywhere, in the water, the streets, on the islands. Many would never be recovered, and today they remain in the waters or immersed in the soil. There's no doubt the devastation of that event caused a lot of heartache, both physically and psychologically. The U.S. military suffered more than 1,100 wounded in the attack. Hospital facilities were relatively robust in Hawaii. Pearl Harbor Hospital became overcrowded in 1940, and so the Naval History and Heritage Command reports every effort had been made to add to the bed capacity, equipment, supplies, and personnel of the Hawaiian area. But, of course, nothing could have prepared them for the scope of the attack. Some facilities were damaged. The hospital tents that housed the sick bay and dispensary were set on fire by incendiary ammunition at the Marine Corps station at Iwa. Casualties at the Naval Air Station on the island of Kaneohe overwhelmed the small dispensary there. The evacuation to Honolulu not immediately possible. Several casualties were sent to the Kaneohe Territorial Hospital for the insane. While the efforts of the Navy Medical Department were commended after the attack, still facilities were overwhelmed. The Naval History and Heritage Command writes, ashore, immediately after the attack, first aid stations were set up quickly in the receiving barracks, recreation center, yard dispensary, officers club, submarine base dispensary, Naval Air Station dispensary, and Marine barracks. The section base dispensary at Bishop's Point helped the Army to care for men from Hickam Field. Still, they continue. Because of lack of time and insufficient medical personnel, surgical operations could not always be performed upon men within 6 hours after they were wounded. Bowen quoted the experience of Lieutenant Kealoha of the Honolulu Fire Department, injured in the attack. I was thrown into an army truck and taken to the hospital at Fort Shafter. I was kept outside on the grass all night. My wet clothes dried right on me. The large U.S. Naval Hospital at Pearl Harbor required help from the community. The Naval History and Heritage Command continues. A doctor of the Medical Corps who was convalescing after a major operation voluntarily returned to duty and worked until he became exhausted at the end of the 3rd day. A large number of civilian women who had nursing or first aid training volunteered to assist the 29 Navy nurses. A total of 114 registered nurses were supplied through the local Red Cross, with as many as 26 of these on duty at one time. About 8 or 10 nurses who were wives of enlisted men were of valuable assistance. The injuries were not limited to the military facilities, Bowen notes, and so it went throughout the morning. Reports of explosions and injured persons were coming into the HFD Alarm Bureau from all over Honolulu. One occurred on the grounds of Lolani Palace. Another killed a man at Washington Place. 4 civilian employees at Pearl Harbor died when their car was hit on Judd Street. They'd been trying to get to work. A woman died from shrapnel wounds in Upper Nuuanu Valley, 8 miles from the military target. Several amateur boxers were wounded or killed while eating at a salmon stand at Nuuanu and Kukui Streets. The total of civilian casualties rose rapidly, most of the people being victims of bizarre accidents as they sought to protect their families and property. Some of the survivors had very frightening stories to relate about their harrowing experiences. One person tells about shrapnel shearing off a telephone pole 6 inches above his head. Another of walls falling where she had stood seconds before. A third speaks of shrapnel breaking a window in front of her just as she stumbled over a curb and fell headlong to the ground. The very last page of the Advertiser's December 8th edition makes a brief mention. A state of emergency now exists in Hawaii under provisions of the M-Day bill following a proclamation by the governor. That proclamation would come to be much in the following days and years. This referred to a provision of the 1900 Hawaiian Organic Act, which established the territory of Hawaii. One provision read that the governor shall be responsible for the faithful execution of the laws of the United States and the territory of Hawaii within the said territory, and whenever it becomes necessary, he may call upon the commanders of the military and naval forces of the United States in the territory of Hawaii, or summon the posse comitatus, or call out the militia of the territory to prevent or suppress lawless violence, invasion, insurrection, or rebellion in said territory. And he may, in case of rebellion or invasion or imminent danger thereof, when the public safety requires it, suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, or place the territory or any part thereof under martial law until communication can be had with the president and his decision thereon made known. The one sentence on the back page of the December 8th edition of the Honolulu Advertiser seems to miss the significance of the governor's proclamation. Hawaii was now under martial law and would be for the next 3 years. The website of the History Channel explains, in the wake of Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaiian civilians struggled to understand what had just happened and to make sense of the announcement that their island was now under martial law. The military enforced a strict curfew, took control of labor, including wages, working conditions, and allocation of laborers. They censored the press, radio transmissions, long-distance phone calls, and outgoing mail. Hospitals, food and liquor stores, and even prostitution were under the direct control of the military. All civilians except small children were registered, fingerprinted, and required to carry identification at all times. Rights of habeas corpus and trial by jury were suspended. Because nearly 1/3 of the population was of Japanese heritage, Hawaii could not afford internment as done on the mainland, but the activities of Japanese Americans were specifically curtailed, and people could be arrested without warrant or trial. Some 2,000 were arrested in the first 48 hours after the attack, and 10,000 eventually arrested, with some 2,000 interred or transferred to detention on the mainland. Some civil authority was returned in March of 1943, but martial law in Hawaii did not end until October 1944. In the end, none of these detainees was found guilty of any overt acts against U.S. law. None were accused of sabotage. Only a few were accused of espionage, and only one, a German citizen living in Hawaii, was found guilty of spying on behalf of the Japanese. He was sentenced to 50 years hard labor and deported to Germany after the war. The 1946 United States Supreme Court case Duncan versus Kahanamaku avoided the issue of military rule, but did rule that supplanting of trial by jury with military courts was unconstitutional. December 7th, 1941 changed the nation and the world, but no place was more changed by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor than the territory of Hawaii. Waking up on December 8th, still under the threat of Japanese attack, told that saboteurs were in their midst and facing the uncertain future under military rule, the islands were forever changed. The thousands and thousands of military personnel that came through the islands during the war transformed the Hawaiian culture and landscape and helped to give rise to the tourist culture that would then propel the territory towards statehood in 1949.
You know, I think that this December 8th is such a good idea for an episode. Honestly, this concept that, you know, we remember December 7th. It's the date that lives in infamy, but December 8th is a day that I think we forget about because it took us a while. You know, it was months still before we really started having an ability to respond to what happened, and we were still dealing with stuff. But that I try to think of what it was like to wake up on December 8th. I mean, even, you know, in the mainland United States, but in Hawaii, you're waking up on December 8th, and when
the smoke was still pouring out of the ships,
you had no idea.
what was this episode really started. I mean, Josh writes a lot of the episodes. I happened to write this episode, but I mean, this episode really started with there were a bunch of things about Pearl Harbor I wanted to talk about. And I was trying to figure out how to kind of group them together. And it happened to be that year the release day was on the 8th and not on the 7th. But I mean, and there's a lot in there. There's a lot. We're talking about the Honolulu Fire Department. Yeah. We're talking, you know, but. No, I mean, things changed in the U.S. right away. Immediately, things changed. People were running off to enlist, and you know, eventually the Japanese internment, of course, and you know, we shift to a war economy. Things changed immediately after the attack on December 7th. But in Hawaii, I mean, that was like the next day. I mean, you had a different form of government. And it wasn't just that your island had been attacked and like school children killed. I mean, there were civilian casualties and lots of damage, infrastructure damage, and et cetera. And rumors that there were saboteurs and that they might invade at any moment because we didn't know if there was an invasion fleet that was going to follow up on the attack. And it's not just all of that, and the loss of security that you would have after the attack, but it was also that everybody just kind of changed all the rules on you kind of instantly. And I thought that was worthy of discussion. And one of the things that really struck me was looking at those newspapers on the 8th. On the front you've got the attack, and then in the back you've got lists of casualties, and in the middle you have the length of dress sleeves this season. And they still have advertisements for the movie. I mean, obviously they weren't showing movies on the 8th, in the regular theaters, but I mean their ads are still there, and
some of that stuff you have to think was just already ready for the printer.
Oh yeah,
and what do you
you got to
do?
You got to get the newspaper out, and so who knows? Who knows? Yeah. But it's weird because it's not all just a war newspaper. It's mostly a newspaper that was clearly laid out, on the 7th.
With the idea that it was going to be
extra. By the way, they bombed the snot out of us yesterday on this very island. It's hard to understand how much World War II changed things. How much? I mean, it's not just that the U.S. knew that war with the U.S. officials knew that war with Japan was coming, but I mean the whole nation knew that we were moving towards war. I mean the reason from the first one from the war, the reason that the Minnesota Naval National Guard was called up is because we knew that war was coming, and we were taking all the ships out of mothballs and all that sort of stuff, and the nation knew war was coming, and yet it was still such a shock. To move from peace to war overnight, and I don't know wars are fought differently these days, and we don't necessarily. I mean, in some ways, we've been at war for 2 decades now with the global war on terror and et cetera. But I mean, I don't know that most people alive today in the U.S. have any concept of that idea that we are suddenly and truly at war, except maybe the feeling that we had after 9/11. And so this was just obviously in Sarah as startling as 9/11. Everybody knew where they were when they heard that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. And so that's what this episode was meant, but also to talk about their other heroes that that we didn't talk about. One of those being the men of the Honolulu Fire Department who put themselves at great risk to go put out fires on a military base. I mean, to an extent, it wasn't their job, but I mean, they were the only ones that could do it, and they were, those are brave men. Some who lost their lives, who gave all as firefighters. You don't necessarily think about that, but I mean, there are a lot of those emergency personnel are put in great risk at war. A lot of them died fighting fires throughout the war. When the city's been bombed, the firefighters roll out. They're not soldiers, but they're still there fighting the fires which risk their lives. And then a lot of times the bombs start coming again, and that happened in Europe, and that happened in Asia, and that happened at Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these were people who were going in. They weren't armed. They had not signed up for the military. It's
not
brave.
like if you had a pistol, you're going to take a plane down.
Well, true.
Yeah, I mean,
also,
this idea that they're using toilet paper and soap to plug the holes in the radiator so they can keep the pumper truck going.
Admittedly, you would probably not blame them if you fly in because you're the only fire engine. Your fire engine immediately gets shot to hell. I think my response was
I'll wait till the attack is over, and then maybe we'll confide. No, but they just did their jobs.
Yeah.
And so I mean, this episode, it's another one that has just a lot of different things in it. But the whole idea of it is to say, we remember December 7th, but do we really understand what December 7th meant until we look at December 8th and see, how much lives has changed, how much the world has changed. We've done a lot of episodes on the home front and risks that people took on the home front. And I mean, the very first episode of the History Guy was talking about the home front, right? It was talking about a naval supply depot in Utah. And we talk a lot about that, but I mean, that wasn't something that we slowly kind of moved into. I mean, that was for most of the nation. I mean, a lot of preparation came before, but for most of the nation, that was overnight, one day. On December 7th, on December 6th or before the attack, it is just a normal day. And the next day, the whole nation has a whole different idea of what's important.
And the fact that 20 minutes, basically, about 20 minutes, that can happen, just is actually shocking. When I asked Lance, how long was it? How much did it take? Just those two flurries. And so just think that you're in downtown, they're on the island and so forth, and that happens, and then it goes away and you see the smoke, And yeah, you read the newspaper and you know that Aunt Molly went to have tea with so and so. It's just absolutely, how do you adjust that fast to to total devastation of your place?
It's crazy. And they were on very much on the front line. And again, now we can look back and say, there really never was a risk of them invading Hawaii. But I tell you, if on December 6th you didn't think they were probably going to attack Pearl Harbor, by December 8th, I can see why you're like, they might invade at any time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there were actually, it's in some of the reports on the day saying that they had landed saboteurs and that they were. I mean, so you had every reason to believe. And of course, the Navy had every reason to think they've devastated our fleet. They're planning to invade and take the Hawaiian Islands.
Which would be crazy.
I think that risk was very well understood.
Yeah.
I think people really did. You had every reason to feel insecure. And who knew? We didn't know where the fleet was. We've largely been blinded because they knocked out most of our reconnaissance aircraft.
You don't know if the rest of the fleet is still around. I mean, for all you know,
you don't know how big the Japanese fleet is, or where they are, or what their intention is. Yeah,
no idea what happened.
That changed. I mean, that's just a change in security. Nobody in Hawaii could have been feeling safe. No. And of course, there were lots of not just rumors of saboteurs, but also rumors that there were conspirators there and stuff like that. Yeah. Very fascinating. The only person that was actually found to be a conspirator was a German American.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So I mean, at the time, and they couldn't do internment in Japan like they did in the United States because it was just too large. The Japanese descendants were too big a part of the population. But I mean, the immediate mistrust of people of your own nation, which turned out to be, entirely unfounded. I mean, there simply wasn't any evidence that anybody there was working with the Japanese or anything. Yeah.
It's always a tragedy when we talk about the Japanese internment, and I mean, one of the reasons is because none of them seem to have done anything, or extremely small numbers. It's just that they were ultimately Americans, and it's not just that we interned them, but they lost their businesses and their homes and
their property.
This is and it's hard because it's hard to say that you don't understand why that's your gut reaction. That I mean, I understand that. It's also just not it's not fair, and it wasn't fair to those people.
It's horrible to imagine that, I mean, I probably made sense at the time why people mistrusted and stuff like that, but you wish we could. I mean, that's not supposed to be how we are. We're supposed to be the sort of nation where we accept, everybody of all backgrounds. Yeah. And especially, the number that served very, very bravely in the U.S. Armed Forces and things like that. And, I mean, and in addition to that change of law, I mean, they suspended trial by jury. They suspended habeas corpus. You could be arrested on mere suspicion. You could be tried by a military tribunal without representation, and that obviously could happen because you looked like the people who attacked us. And so
they're definitely under greater suspicion,
and that's a different shift in your feeling of safety too. It's not just that this island could be attacked and you don't know the intentions of people that are attacking it, but now your own government mistrusts you.
You don't know that you can trust them or how to explain that they can trust you, and it's hard.
They can just bust on the door, take your brother, and walk away, and they don't even have to explain what the charge is. They don't have to charge him.
Well, and that's that was controversial at the time too. But I mean, that's happened. It happened during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln also suspended habeas corpus, and it's hard. It's hard to imagine doing it. It's hard to imagine feeling okay that it was done, and it's different. And I also think the people of Hawaii at the time it was a territory, and that's I don't know that we think about that a lot. That it wasn't a state and that they were.
Well, and I think weren't there was bombing in the Philippines and some other places too. Oh, yeah. And but the primary interest, or really what we know, was Pearl Harbor. And I hadn't.
That's right. Whenever you talk about all the other attacks that occurred,
there were a number of other attacks.
Yeah. I mean, FDR did when he gave the speech. FDR mentioned all these other places were attacked too, in order to show the wave of it. But it was just as horrible. And the Philippines was also a territory, and so
that's true.
And those were Americans as much as the people at Pearl Harbor were. but
well, in the
also,
Philippines, I
Guam
mean,
and
largely, I mean, there was
well,
resistance in the Philippines for some time, but
Yeah.
much of the country,
more people who served bravely. Yeah,
Yeah.
the people in the Philippine military that were serving. I mean, more people who bravely fought to the death, for the same cause, and we don't remember it nearly as much at all.
Yeah, we knew that the Philippines was not in a position to defend itself. We knew that it was vulnerable, and to be honest, when you look at the preparations before the war, it looked like we understood that we just simply didn't have enough time to make the Philippines defensible.
Well, it was just this line, because for a long time we're trying not to provoke.
Yeah.
And that means that we don't build any fortifications in the Pacific. And at the point that Japan leaves the naval treaty, and we understand we don't have a chance, there's not enough time. That's where the two of the carriers were, by the way, at Pearl Harbor, is that they were busy sending airplanes. One was sending airplanes to Wake, and one was sending airplanes to Midway. And so it turns out the carriers weren't sunk because they were preparing for the war that we knew that was coming. So it wasn't like we were shocked that war came. We just didn't know it was coming then and there, and with that much ferocity, we thought we would have a warning, and it would go be an honorable war where two ships or two fleets would come out and shoot at each other.
Yeah, we didn't expect the well, and I mean that's I think that's why the Japanese did it. It was a gutsy move, and their goal was to have this massive attack that would either disable us long enough that they would be able to secure what they needed to secure, or even honestly force us into a position where we just simply couldn't.
Well, they knew when we went to war, we'd probably prioritize Europe. And so there's a lot of, and honestly, the attack worked.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, they were able to take the Philippines. They were able to take our Pacific Island territories. They were able to move, all the way through Southeast Asia where they wanted. They were able to threaten British India, which is where they wanted to go. And it took a very long time for the U.S. to recover to the point that we could materially do much about it. We did. I mean, it's great to see the things we did with our remaining aircraft carriers. Even though eventually we would to lose those. What it did not do is to demoralize the nation so that we didn't want to fight. It energized the nation so that we did.
Well, and you look at what Yamato, who made the plan, seemed to be aware that if you didn't essentially knock us out immediately, that Japan didn't have the industrial capacity.
Yamamoto, right?
Yamamoto, right.
The ship was Yamato, but I mean that's the legend. He says I fear we've awakened a sleeping dragon, and the plan apparently was to attack after declaring war, and then the embassy was not able to manage to get the copies there.
It ultimately I feel like it was kind of a cop-out no matter what. I mean, it was supposed to be essentially a surprise attack, but...
Yeah. If you deliver the letter 30 minutes before you attack, it's still going to be... Yeah. But I mean, there was a propaganda thing in it, but I mean, there's a lot of discussion. I mean, all those, about. I mean, the bottom line is, let's say that we had figured out what was going on with the attack with the ward. Let's see that we had read the radar properly and we had planes in the air. Let's say the battle fleet had managed to get out of the harbor so they could better maneuver and weren't as badly damaged. I mean, we would have still been at war. It still would have been a dastardly attack, or as it was stated by the president. I don't think it took the casualties of Pearl Harbor to throw us wholeheartedly into the war. No. And so there's no reason, that we would have wished that. I mean, that, the attack, you would have to say from a military standpoint, the attack was shockingly successful.
Yeah.
And I mean, really very little like it in world history to have taken what was considered to be, the most powerful naval force in the Pacific and to essentially neutralize it in an hour. And so you can't say it wasn't successful. That's part of what the episode kind of shows is how much we had to change our life because of it. Yeah. But in the end, it wasn't maybe there was never going to be enough because of the difference in the size of the two nations and the production capacity and all that sort of things. But that in the end it failed. As a matter of fact, in the end it energized the United States into a war that got in some points you would say vindictive because of Pearl Harbor. But at the time you say that you had to come away from that. I mean Yamamoto had to come away from that saying this succeeded beyond our wildest dreams.
My goodness,
how could it have done better?
I mean, hardly. We literally were hardly able to mount any kind of defense.
Yeah, it was caught us by surprise, and essentially disabled at least in a 4 months at least every single capital ship in the U.S. Pacific Fleet except for the 3 that didn't happen to be there that day.
Yeah. I mean, it is really hard to imagine. In almost any situation, anyone would have been like, "Wow, this was an incredible success for a military operation." And it's hard to say that when you're on the losing side of it, but and its tragedy, no matter who's on what side. But it was ultimately, I mean, it was a successful attack, and it absolutely, I mean, without Pearl Harbor, even if we entered the war eventually, it wouldn't have done to Hawaii what it did to Hawaii.
Oh yeah, it wouldn't have necessarily changed there the way they did. Yeah. I mean, that's Pearl Harbor did, which is exactly what this episode is about. And there was a lot of heroism at Pearl Harbor. I mean, even in defeat. And so, the people that were rescuing sailors out of sunken ships, the people that were shooting back even though they, that wasn't their job, and the people who came and fought those fires while being shot at, those are heroes. And the boxers that were buying breakfast, they got machine gunned, those were casualties of war. That shows, that the war isn't clean. It doesn't just shoot at soldiers. And so these are all stories. There's reasons that we should be remembering Pearl Harbor. And I think a lot of people, maybe my generation, feel that we just don't remember it like we used to. I mean, they just don't talk about it as much on December 7th as we once did. But there's reasons that we need to remember. And, one of the reasons is because it really impacted real lives, and those people's lives deserve to be remembered.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.